the glen. Eldritch materialized from the crimson glow, his feet touching the soft, damp earth of a woodland clearing. Towering ancient trees stretched high above him, their dense canopy filtering sunlight into emerald streaks across the forest floor. The air was thick with the scent of earth and wildflowers, a stark contrast to the bleak lands of Necros and the cold fog of London he had left behind. He sat on a moss-covered stone, pressing his palms against his knees, steadying himself. He knew what this trial demanded. His opponent would be an Alpha, a being of pure, primal strength, the pinnacle of Lysanor's creation. But where was it? Who or what was this Alpha? Eldritch closed his eyes, allowing his mind to settle. He had no elder powers, no weapons, nothing but his mind and experience. The question was no longer whether he could kill the Alpha. He already knew he couldn't overpower it. The real question was how to survive it. Then the woods shook, a sound, deep, guttural, and filled with a force of nature that no mortal being could replicate. It was not just a growl, it was a command to everything that breathed within these woods. The undergrowth trembled, even the wind seemed to hesitate. Then, thunderous footfalls. It was coming. Through the shadows of the ancient trees, a shape appeared, a titan of fur, muscle, and rage. Its massive paws crushed the earth beneath them, its movements fluid yet terrifyingly powerful. A predator without equal, its instincts honed beyond centuries of survival. The Alpha was on the hunt, and Eldritch was the intruder. He stood, watching the trees shake as it approached, running directly toward him. No time to run, no time to hide. This was his trial, and the beast was unstoppable. Far from Eldritch, beyond the emerald glow of the glen, Lysanor stood, the god of the Lycans, towering and primal, a force of pure nature given form. His silvered eyes scanned the ancient woodland, feeling the imbalance brought by the intruder. Eldritch had come, just as the trials dictated, but the game had to be fair. Lysanor would not choose an Alpha driven by vengeance or personal ties to Eldritch. No, this must be a battle dictated by the laws of nature itself. He would not call his current Alpha, for Eldritch and the reigning wolf had a history. That would taint the trial, tipping the balance. No, this must be fought on neutral ground, between predator and prey, without sentiment. Lysanor looked deeper into the lineage of his Alphas, into the long bloodline of those who had taken and held the title, not by birthright, but by sheer dominance. And he found the one. The chosen Alpha. In the depths of the primeval forest, far beyond where even the oldest of Lycans dared tread, a presence stirred. It had been ages since it last awoke, since it last hunted. A shadow streaked through the underbrush, fast, silent, unstoppable. The Alpha. Not the first, nor the last, but one of the strongest. A wolf that had never been bested in combat. One that did not seek power for greed or ambition, but simply because it must be so. It was balance. Once, he had been just another Lycan, a warrior among his kind, fighting to protect his pack, to survive in the wild. But challenge after challenge, he climbed the ranks, until he stood before the Alpha of his time. and he tore him down, not out of hatred, not out of arrogance, but because the strongest must reign. This was the law of the Lycans, of Lysanor's will. Through ferocity, speed, cunning, and raw survival instinct, he had carved his way to the top, becoming a champion Alpha, one of Lysanor's greatest. He had long since transcended the realm of Earth, called into Lysanor's domain, where he lived eternally as a guardian of the natural order. He did not serve Lysanor. He did not worship him. He was simply one with the law of nature. And now there was imbalance. The intruder was here, and the hunt had begun. A deep guttural growl rumbled through the trees. The forest trembled, then thunderous footfalls, like the rolling drum of a coming storm. Each step shook the ground as the beast charged, a blur of muscle, claw, and raw instinct. Eyes glowing like molten gold, breath hot as fire, jaws ready to crush bone and flesh alike. This was no simple beast. This was the Alpha, and it was coming for Eldritch. Eldritch sat on the damp earth, his mind racing. He had fought beside an Alpha once, seen firsthand their power, their unstoppable force of nature. But now he was meant to stand against one. How? He had faced gods. He had outmaneuvered death itself. But this was something different. Alphas were not driven by hatred or ambition. They did not seek victory for dominance, nor did they revel in destruction like Duncan McDruston had. They were pure primal force, a thinking man's worst nightmare. There was no reasoning with an Alpha once it entered the primal rage. No outwitting, no negotiation, no appealing to a higher logic. When an Alpha saw its foe, there was only one outcome. The balance demanded it, not out of malice, not out of vengeance, simply because it must be so. Eldritch clenched his fists, staring at the soft glow of the crimson tear. He had relied on his mind for 2 trials now. But this trial, this thing, it stole that from him. How do you defeat something that takes away your greatest weapon? The Alpha did not care for words. It did not fear deception. It did not fall for tricks. It would simply hunt. And he was the prey. His breath slowed as the weight of that realization sank in. I am helpless against this beast. Even if he had his elder power, he would still lose. Now he had nothing. No strength, no allies, no mind games. He was nothing more than a rabbit caught in a trap. A soft breeze whispered through the trees. The scent of damp earth and ancient wood drifted around him, wrapping him in the overwhelming presence of the glen. Eldritch slowly lifted his head. He could feel it. Somewhere out there. It was coming. The hunt had begun. Eldritch crouched low, pressing his palm into the damp earth, his breath controlled, his thoughts racing. The Alpha was coming. It would be here soon. He had no time to build a fortress, no time to dig pits or construct elaborate snares, no time to overthink. But he didn't need time. He had knowledge, and knowledge was all a hunter ever needed. Fire would not stop the Alpha, but smoke would blind it, dull its nose, steal its breath. Eldritch's fingers worked fast. He gathered the driest wood he could find, small, brittle branches, snapped from low brush, things that would burn fast and hot. Then he found moss and damp leaves, moist enough to smoulder instead of ignite. 2 minutes later, he had his traps. 3 piles of firewood, spread in a rough half-circle, moss stacked atop the wood, enough to create thick, choking smoke when lit. A simple trigger, a single lit ember beneath each pile, held in place by a ball of dried pine sap. Once the heat built, the resin would ignite, the smoke would rise, and the Alpha would lose its greatest weapon, its senses. Eldritch rushed through the underbrush, his mind recalling every battlefield trick he had ever learned. He needed something to slow the beast, something simple, something fast. His hand snapped a long, thin vine from the trees, stretching it low across the clearing between two sturdy trunks. The Alpha wouldn't see it. It wouldn't stop the beast, but it would force it to hesitate. And hesitation was death. Eldritch scanned the trees, looking for something heavy, something unstable. His eyes locked onto a rotting branch, thick and dead but still barely attached to its trunk. He had no time for pulleys, no time for complex mechanics. Instead, he lashed a second vine to the branch, tied it just tight enough that a sudden force, a struggling Alpha tangled in the tripline, would send it crashing down. The moment the beast stumbled, the branch would snap, and when it did, it would fall like a hammer. Eldritch stepped back, wiping sweat from his brow. The traps were set. They were simple. They were crude. But they were effective. And more than anything, they were ready. The forest grew silent. The wind stilled. Somewhere, beyond the tree line, a shadow moved. The Alpha was here. Eldritch took a deep breath, rolled his shoulders, and prepared for the battle of his life. The forest trembled. Eldritch felt it before he saw it. The shift in the air, the silence that followed, the sheer weight of its presence. Then it emerged. From the depths of the trees, a beast unlike any other stepped into the glen. Its fur was dark as the void, absorbing the moonlight rather than reflecting it. Its eyes burned with primal intelligence, not just rage. Its muscles rippled beneath its thick hide, every movement fluid, controlled, purposeful. It was massive, bigger than any Alpha Eldritch had ever encountered, more than a predator, more than a force of nature. This was a creature that belonged to the glen, and Eldritch was the intruder. The Alpha did not snarl. It did not rush forward in a blind frenzy like lesser beasts. Instead, it stepped into the glade with confidence, its head held high, its breath steady. It had already won. It saw Eldritch's traps. It sensed the tension in the air. It understood the game, and it wasn't impressed. Eldritch's chest tightened. He had seen Alphas before, had fought beside them, had watched them lead packs with brutal efficiency. But this was something different. This beast walked as if it owned the world, and maybe it did. Eldritch was trapped. He couldn't run. The Alpha was too fast. He couldn't fight. He had no power, no weapons, nothing but his wits. His only hope had been his traps, but the Alpha saw through them instantly. It didn't fall for them. It didn't hesitate. It merely snorted at them, dismissing them with a slow shake of its head. This was not balance. Lysanor had promised a fair trial, yet this was anything but fair. How could he, a mere man, stand against such a force? Then Eldritch noticed something. The glade was watching. It was subtle at first, a whisper, a tingle at the back of his mind. Then he saw it. The trees, the grass, the air itself. They were watching. The glen was alive. Lysanor's trial was not just a fight. It was a test of balance. And this was no balance. Eldritch was not an equal match for this Alpha. He never had been. So why was he here? Why was he chosen? Then it hit him. The Alpha had been chosen because it was the strongest. Eldritch had been chosen because he was the weakest. This was a test to see if the weak could survive the strong, if mind could overcome muscle, if wisdom could balance primal instinct. Eldritch exhaled, steadying his breath. This wasn't about killing the Alpha. It wasn't about defeating it in combat. It was about surviving, because in nature, Survival was balance. The Alpha lowered itself, muscles tensing. It was ready to pounce. Eldritch only had seconds. The glen had given him the answer. Now he had to act on it. The Alpha tensed, muscles coiled, ready to strike. Eldritch knew the feeling. It was the same sensation a rabbit must feel when a wolf sets its sights on it. A force of instinct, a predator fulfilling its purpose, a cycle as old as time. And yet, not all prey perished. The smallest creatures in the wild endured, not because they were strong, but because they understood balance. Eldritch's mind raced. Lions ruled the savannah, but the sparrow still sang in the trees. Bears ruled the mountains, but the hare still darted through the underbrush. Tigers dominated the jungle, but the tortoise endured the ages. The strong ruled, but the small survived, and they did so without teeth, without claws, without brute force. They endured through balance. The Alpha prowled in a slow circle around Eldritch, its eyes locked onto him, waiting for the first sign of movement. This was its territory, its glen. It had walked these lands for centuries. The strongest always survived. The weakest always perished. That was its law. That was its truth. But what if it wasn't? Eldritch had no power, no weapons, no way to fight. But he had something else, a new rule. Eldritch took a slow step back. The Alpha's ears flicked. It was watching every movement, waiting for weakness. Eldritch had no intention of running. Instead, he moved differently. He took another small, slow step, not in retreat, but in something else entirely. Submission. Not fearful, but aware. The Alpha hesitated. It knew fear. It knew strength. But this was not weakness. This was not panic. This was something else. Something it didn't understand. Eldritch wasn't challenging it. He wasn't fleeing from it. He was doing what no one had done before. He was becoming part of the balance. The Alpha stopped circling. This was not what it had expected. Prey ran. Prey hid. Prey fought. But this prey was something different. It wasn't resisting. It wasn't bowing. It was accepting. The glen was watching. Lysanor was watching. Eldritch had realized the truth of the trial. This was not about strength. This was not about dominance. This was about survival. Balance. The Alpha's instincts warred against each other. It wanted to kill. But what was the challenge in hunting something that wasn't running? For the first time, it hesitated. And in that hesitation, Eldritch had found his answer. The smallest creature in the wild. Eldritch knew he was no warrior here. He wasn't the wolf. He wasn't the bear. He wasn't the tiger. He was the sparrow. He was the rabbit. He was the turtle. He was the survivor. And survival was balance. The Alpha growled low, uncertain. It had been sent to kill. It had been sent to prove its strength. But this was no battle. This was something else entirely. The rules had changed, and now the beast had to decide. Eldritch stood before the Alpha. It was more than a beast. It was nature itself. It was order, instinct and wrath, given flesh and bone. And yet, the glen was wrong. Eldritch could see it, could feel it. This was a land of balance. But there was none. The Alpha was starving, but not for food, for purpose. There were no birds, no rabbits, no life. The balance was broken. Eldritch took a deep breath, his mind clearing. He had no weapons, no powers, no strength, but he had understanding. He lowered himself onto his knees. Then he bowed. "I give myself to the glen," he said. The Alpha hesitated. It sniffed the air, stepping forward, confusion flashing in its deep golden eyes. Eldritch felt it first. A pull, a deep primordial force tearing at him, drawing something from inside. His essence, his being. The glen was taking him. His breath hitched, his body growing weaker by the second. His skin paled, his vision dimmed. Something in the glen shifted. A single feather drifted down from the sky. A sparrow landed on a branch. The trees rustled, the first heartbeat of something new. Then life erupted. Birds took flight. A rabbit bounded through the brush. The earth trembled as deer stepped into the clearing. The Alpha stood still. It watched the world return. The glen was waking. The balance restored. Eldritch collapsed. His body fell limp to the ground, his breath leaving him in a final, shuddering gasp. The Alpha stepped forward. It sniffed at Eldritch's lifeless form and froze. There was something familiar, a scent long buried in time, a connection to another, to kin, a memory deep in the Alpha's blood, an Alpha it once knew, a name it did not speak but felt. The beast lifted its head to the sky and howled. The forest stirred. The animals rushed toward Eldritch. A surge of energy, pure, wild, primal, the very essence of the glen. A golden light spilled from the earth, from the creatures, from the Alpha itself. It flooded into Eldritch's body. His fingers twitched. His chest rose with a breath. His eyes opened. He had given himself to the glen. But the glen had not needed his sacrifice, only his reminder. When Eldritch sat up, the Alpha was gone. The forest was alive. The birds sang. The leaves whispered. The world had balance. He had passed the trial. A soft, golden glow flickered through the trees. A wisp of light danced through the air, weaving gently between the leaves, drifting toward Eldritch. Then a voice that was neither harsh nor gentle, but ancient, a voice that carried the weight of storms and the whisper of the wind. Eldritch. He turned towards the glow, instinctively straightening his posture. Lysanor, the voice of the wild, the force of balance, the god of the Lycans. The wisp hovered before him, its glow pulsing with life. How did you know? Lysanor asked. Eldritch exhaled, still feeling the echo of the life that had returned to the glen. Because of a man, he answered. The light shifted, almost curious. A man, Eldritch nodded. His name is Winter. The glow flashed, brightening for a moment, then softened, almost amused. Oh yes, Lysanor's voice carried a note of recognition. Winter. The wisp circled Eldritch once, its golden light twisting like a ribbon in the air. It was I who gave him my strength. Eldritch furrowed his brow. You helped him? Freely. Lysanor's voice held no hesitation. Without price, without debt. I gave him what was mine, because he needed it to restore the balance of all things. Eldritch stared at the golden light before him. For a god of primal nature, Lysanor spoke with a calm certainty that was almost unsettling. Eldritch had fought gods, seen them manipulate, trade and scheme, and yet Lysanor had given his power freely because balance demanded it. They spoke for a time, of winter, of realms, of power and purpose. Eldritch felt something shift in the space between them. Lysanor was not like Necros or Nocturna. He did not meddle, did not bargain, did not rule. He simply was. Your trials are complete, Eldritch. The golden wisp drifted closer. The light surrounded him, its warmth sinking into his very soul. Then the world disappeared, and Eldritch was gone.